All right, I think we can start. If some people join us later, that's fine, but we can start already.
Emma, I have a question for you.
Sorry?
Because of the reverb, will you be going on and off with muting and non-muting yourself?
Yes. So whenever I'm not talking, I will mute myself, or whenever not someone else in the audience. Yeah. All right.
Great. Okay. Because yeah. Okay.
Great. Okay. Thank you for the people live and online for being here for the final session of the day. Thank you, Kara, for being here. We're going to have an interview now. And just as an introduction, Kara Judea Alhadev, sorry, on your website, you describe yourself as mother, anarcha-feminist, artist, author, professor, action philosopher, and environmental justice activist. And if you look around on your website, you also see that you're incredibly prolific as a writer and as an artist. We also saw that already in the breaks. So just to start, what is it that helps you to be so creative? What is it that keeps you going?
Okay, thank you, Emma. First of all, can people see me, or am I too backlit? I'm in a school bus with 22 windows, so I'm visible. Okay,
Yeah, it's very well visible. Yeah.
Okay, great. And if you're interested in seeing our home, I'm happy to show that too. So your question, what keeps me going? That's your question. I would say primarily the motivation for what it means to wake up every morning is really embodying this simultaneity of both the beauty and the horror of what it means to be alive in 2023. And since I was a child, that simultaneity of these extraordinary oppositional but co-nourishing realities of both our everyday violence and the everyday extraordinary beauty that we experience, that many of us experience it in more tactile, more visceral ways than others, at least on the surface. That coexistence is what compels me to move and to be on the move in a continuous, not just individually, but have it be a pedagogical imperative, have that simultaneity be my imperative for both how I breathe, how I function, and how I interact with other people as a hopeful kind of a model for resistance, but not resistance in reaction to, not as an allergic reaction, but resistance as another twist on beauty, another twist on the horror that is in dialogue with the two. So resistance itself is an unfolding rather than a slamming into. And I'm happy to go more into that.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that's already really inspiring. I think I wanted to remark also to the audience that Kara and I talked about this before. And if you have questions during the interview, just let me know. We don't have to wait until the end. You can interrupt us. Well, it would be nice if you raise your hand, but you can ask questions during the interview. And that also goes for the people online, of course. What I was also wondering, we've been talking a lot about anarchism this conference, of course, and I think most of us are aware that not two anarchists have the same definition or understanding of anarchism. So how would you describe what anarchism or anarcha-feminism, what that means for you?
So many things, as for all of us. I would say one of the main lived realities of what it means to be, to do, to breathe anarchism is the impossibility, the constant reminder of impossibility that must be embodied, that the impossible must be in our cellular framework as a lived collective possibility where we generate our epigenetic potential to shift infrastructures that rely on excess of, for example, Western industrial imperialism, or what Alexis beautifully referred to when she met the woman from Harvard who blanked out at the concept of state being actually a construct and not just a given. But that excess of the state, that excess of the colonialist background that dictates so much of how we go to the bathroom, let alone how we are in conversation with other people. But shifting those infrastructures of excess to the excess, again, of our potential, the excess of awe, the excess of beauty, the excess, for example, of a pregnant woman's body, or of a sunset, if I'm going to be sentimental, the excess of eating food that we've grown with water that we have harvested from the rain, or that we've harvested from snowmelt, the excess of truly utilizing children's phenomenal neurological capacities, their vastness, their synaptic, I forget the statistics, maybe Emma, or other people in the audience, the difference between children's capacity for neurological depth and adults in terms of the numbers, the measurable numbers of their synaptic lapses. But harvesting that potential, those impossibilities as social frameworks, as infrastructures, so that we can live very differently, so that we're not living in predetermined realms of normalcy that actually are rooted in these simultaneous oppressions. And again, as Alexis said, with multiple oppressions, we have multiple forms of emancipation. We can embody multiple forms of emancipation if we take collective risks, if we are willing to shift our understanding of the norm, of the taken for granted, of standard of living, which is seen as equality, which is seen as neutrality. But if we can pierce that illusion through perhaps an existential commitment to joy, Nietzsche's commitment to joy, for example, a lived, so not in the marginal realm, not in the surrealist realm, not in the radical realm, because all of that implies other than center, but breaking down the center itself, where these false hierarchies are upturned, so that we understand that our complicity is a choice, as again, referring back to Alexis's presentation. And then how do we imbue that in how we interact with our children? How do we imbue that how we interact with our own bodies? When we're using a flush toilet, are we going through the history, the embodied energy of what it means to be flushing a toilet that is using however many gallons, 7 gallons of drinkable water, and the entire sewage infrastructure, and what those infrastructures of what those exploitative infrastructures have to do with, obviously, human rights, have to do with taken for granted relationships that strip us of our potential intimacies, our intimacies with understanding that when we're opening up a cabinet door, that metal came from a mine whose lives, the miner whose lives were implicated in the horrors of that embodied energy, of that life cycle analysis. When we answer our phone, do we need a phone? Do we need a smartphone? Do we need a credit card? These assumptions of need, which doesn't mean everyone, everyone should live in a school bus, anything like that, but continually questioning these frameworks, like the woman at Harvard, where state is just, it's unfathomable to even question the interlocking strangleholds, but instead where that becomes an imperative of beauty itself, an imperative of not only our commitment to being alive and our commitment to making things better, hopefully, better in the sense of living with integrity. But returning, like a remembering, for example, our genetic, our ancestral, our responsibility.
You've touched upon so many things already. I think one of the things this made me think of was your collective model for eco action that you talk of. I think you already spoke about this a bit, but you call it soul. Could you say a bit more about what that means?
Yeah, soul. So shared, opportunity used, local. Soul, again, returning once again the ancestral, the genetic, our cellular, the memory, a memory that goes far beyond our solipsistic addictions. Um, soul as a bioregional commitment to, and again, I want to say commitment. When I say commitment, I'm not speaking about a moralistic conversion, guilt-based agenda. I'm speaking, when I say commitment, I'm speaking about jumping into the unknown collectively. We're holding hands, we're holding bodies, we're jumping into the unknown. So when I use the term commitment, that's where that's what I'm exploring. So soul as a commitment to these bioregional interconnecting worlds of a fiber shed, a food shed, a watershed, what those micro potentialities of the impossible only because we're in such enmeshed complicity, but actually not impossible. I do believe that's why I'm here with you. But moving into those bioregional interrelated frameworks to question again what it is that we think we need or how we need, again moving into the conversation around sacrifice and compromise. And what if living differently didn't mean better or worse? It didn't mean more moralistic or arrogant or self-righteous or privileged, this equality as assimilation, but it means, again, integrity and curiosity and beauty and play. So an example would be something that you may have heard me speak about before. My son's school, supposedly alternative school, I'm not so sure about that, but where they needed music stands. And rather than just going to buy music stands, when they're constantly having financial struggles, as most schools, most public schools in the US do, going to our community, looking to artisans, looking for creative ways of holding music, of holding the papers that contain the notes that will then generate the music. So finding other ways of being in relation to need with our objects, where objects aren't just simply utilitarian, but where the objects themselves become an intimate relationship, because it's not just something that we acquire through materialist ease, through materialistic acquisition, because we can, supposedly, because we have credit cards and Amazon exists, and these alienating infrastructures of acquisition exist, but where every need becomes a community endeavor. Maybe not every need, but needs like that become a community exploration, where we're inviting those bioregional, again, the fiber sheds, textile, intimacies, the food sheds, the watersheds, where those become part of how we acquire when we are in a moment of challenge in relation to object acquisition. So that would be one example.
Yeah, thank you. And I think another really great example of how you try to live, or how you actually live differently and try to be this model, is the place where you live, right? So you live in a repurposed school bus that you converted with your family together. Could you say a bit more about that? Like why you wanted to do that, and what that process was like to actually try to make that a reality?
Sure, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So this is our bus. I can move the camera around in a moment if you like. Um, Living in an environment like this, where, again, I'm going to go back to the idea of intimacy, interspecies intimacy, where we have a sense of the embodied energy of each of the objects that went into our home. And of course, all homes, you can do this. Even living in an apartment, what you bring into your home can be an evolution of understanding, where you're not just taking for granted those objects, where those objects came from and whose lives were involved, what non-human ecosystems were destroyed in order for those objects to be part of your life. But this feels like the process of having built it and living in it and then sharing it feels like it's an extension of, for example, soul. It feels like an extension of an anarchist commitment of jumping into the unknown because of the combination of, for example, ethics and engineering. When we built the bus, my son he's now 11, he was about 6 at the time. And it took 30 days. It was in the winter in Michigan. We were freezing, literally, for those 30 days. But it was part of his homeschool. It was part of also the community. It was a suburb in off of Detroit, not a suburb, but a small community near Detroit, Michigan. So a pretty impoverished environment where we were, and it became a community reflection of living in a way where we didn't have to be complicit with the norms of living in a home that was based on exploitation, that was based on our comfort being on the backs of other people's sacrifice. And I would say a sacrifice in the conventional sense. So our home, ironically, for example, now our community is dealing with land use codes where homes like ours are illegal because it's a tiny home on wheels and it's seen as devaluing the private property of our neighbors because it's seen as transient, or it is connected to ideologies of negligence, which is so phenomenally ironic to me, and painful. I mean, we've had to move several times because of the entrenchment of statehood and private property, and of course that flows very rapidly into ethnocentrism and xenophobic, again, infrastructures around what it means to be proper, clean. I love this, Alexis, the propertarian. I mean, that's, wow, we're living it when we're confronted with land use codes and the idea of using land, and what hubris that we very comfortably in the US and particularly are saturated in. So I can give a little growth if you want.
Yeah, yeah, that would be nice, I think.
We have the skylights with our home. All the wood is. My husband is a mapped ecologist, a wildlife ecologist, and woodworker. So all the wood is found from the orchards. Not sure what you can see, but everything is repurposed. For example, our home offers an alternative to the average Western industrial standard of living, an alternative to exorbitant, taken for granted energy use, not only because of our minimal consumption, a used DC refrigerator, but because our entire solar power system, such as panels, batteries, controllers, inverter, are reclaimed and actually quite simply configured. Our home models creative, affordable housing as an alternative to greenwashing, the corporatization of off-grid living, and helps to expose the falsehoods of the renewable energy movement, much of which is rooted in the fossil fuel economy, convenience culture, and other normalized
capitalist power structures.
Landfill, the whole idea of landfill itself is a perverse concept that, again, I think we take for granted. The idea of filling land with our trash, when waste itself, things are not wasted unless we, again, the idea of choice, we conceive of them as waste. But when people deem that an object is no longer viable in their home, what does that mean to others? Does that mean it becomes a potential for beauty in another's home? Does that become a potential for education, for people to shift out of to shift out of their habituated obedience, and to consider raising their children aside from that, just shifting a few degrees. I'm not asking for massive paradigm unravelings, but questioning.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you already made a nice bridge, I think, to the next theme I wanted to talk with you about. But maybe before, let's see if there's already questions or comments before we go to another theme. Yeah, do you want to come here to ask it, or do you want me to repeat it? Then you can hear it the best, I think. So there's a question coming up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello.
I just have a question because you talked about your bus. What are your neighbors' attitudes towards it? Because you talk about the state encroaching on, I guess, your privacy, but what are your neighbors' attitudes towards, like, or your community attitudes towards your living situation?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you're asking that. We've lived in very different environments in the bus. Do you need to turn off your mic? Thank you. We've lived in eco villages in the bus. We've lived, as I said, on the outskirts of Detroit, and now we're living basically on the top of a mountain in Colorado in our bus. And I'd say really in every place, the assumption of less than lurks. The assumption of alternative as a failure. And again, this goes back to what I had mentioned earlier about failure not being in the conventional idea of failure, but a failure as not participating in frameworks of horror, in frameworks of devastation for other people's lives. The judgment is, I'd say, is pretty extreme, even in an environment like ours currently, where people have lived in school buses. It's been a fad, it's been something, I did that for a couple of years in my 20s, where it's not a committed anarchic lifestyle. And I don't like the term lifestyle at all, but again, a life jumping into the unknown, a continual, again, as Alexis said, there's no arrival point, right? We are moving from one win challenge to the next challenge. And living in the school bus is that. It's a series of unfolding challenges, but it's a series of unfolding challenges within a sense of integrity, within a sense of collective. I can rage with my son, who's half Black and half Middle Eastern. I can rage with him against the fact that we're in a predominantly white community and the implicit racism that he experiences or that we experience, and feel just a little edge of, I'm perhaps a little less hypocritical as I rage against, for example, environmental racism or institutionalized racism, because I'm living in the bus. And simultaneously, I see with our neighbors, many neighbors accept it as, or they think it's cool, they think it's interesting, but as a frame of a full commitment. For example, we lived in an eco village. We were the only bus, but it was an eco-village where we did all poop in buckets. We did all use human manure, for example, to grow our food. Not just for landscaping, but we had a deeply educated relationship to hygiene, to bacteria, to the science of what happens with feces, human feces specifically. And even in that, the bus was a little off. Even in that, shared transportation was a little off. In other words, the epidemic of individualism, so entrenched, like the state, obviously hand in hand, so entrenched, even in the eco-villages that I've lived in across the US and a little bit in Europe, actually near you, La Commune du Monde, Wiedeldorp in Ghent, where I was not living in a bus, but where the individual privatized, Margaret Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative, that still dictates our cellular structures, our cellular makeup. And that to me is what a commitment, jumping into the unknown with anarchism, and it's a with can apply. And that's what I'm trying to do with our neighbors all the time. I'm trying to share that this isn't temporary. This isn't just camping because we're exploring something different from the norm. It's something much more. The tendrils are much more bound and interpenetrating. And perhaps in Flemish you have a more accurate word than woven or interpenetrating. I'd love to hear if people have other offerings. Yeah.
I don't immediately see new hands, so I think we can go to a new topic first. So yeah, what I wanted to talk with you about also, and you also mentioned it already, is parenting, because you do a lot of work on that. So for example, you reflect on what you call petroleum parenting, and that's something you want to confront. And on your website, you describe it as the market-driven choices parents make that overwhelmingly contribute to humanitarian devastation and ecological destruction. Can you say a bit more about what you mean with this petroleum parenting, and especially what kind of parenting do you think we should try to cultivate instead? You've given some hints, of course, already.
Yeah, so petroleum parenting, perhaps an antidote would be anarchic parenting, a parenting that is still very much based in nourishing the children's physical, psychological safety, and of course, the safety is in itself tremendously problematic and rooted in nation-state thinking and nation-state structures. But if we could agree on certain forms of safety with children and their bodies and their psyches, and simultaneously refusing participation in the pharmaceutical, in the education, the compulsory educational, in the transportation, material acquisition, body phobic oriented frameworks of petroleum parenting, where again the child needs something new supposedly, and you go to a store, you go online now and purchase it, rather than being in community, rather than reaching out in swaps, organizing swaps, so that your child understands that when they need something because their shoes have holes in the soles, that they can trade, a barter, a decolonized economy, where a decolonized economy, a solidarity economy, is rooted in an anarchic frame of parenting, where the child's sense of body borders is in relation to community. Their ability to be, and it is an ability to be naked in public environments, to go to the bathroom in public environments, where shame is not an integral component to what it means to grow up, going through puberty, but where there's, again, curiosity, where they are in relation to their peers as they're swimming or as they're camping, in an outdoor environment where there's a sensitivity to their bodies in relation to the natural world, rather than constantly protecting themselves from the natural world. I think that's one of the main tragedies of petroleum parenting, that we're constantly protecting ourselves from the natural world as we are materializing the natural world, making it another commodity that our children need to consume in safe quantities, in safe spaces. So always regulating rather than inviting the openness and the unknown and the impossibility of that kind of interspecies intimacy with the natural world, where our children are not afraid of their own bodies and not afraid of other people's bodies, different and similar, and the natural world bodies. And one way I think we can really do that is by confronting consumer culture, convenience culture, and not just falling into those traps of, well, of course my child needs this because they will be left out. And not belonging is one of humanity's, again, tragedies. The fear of not belonging, of not fitting in. As Alexis, as you said, making ourselves smaller in order to fit in. But what if, for example, with technology, digital technologies, what if the drive, this relentless drive for our children to fit in and then being compliant with digital technologies, giving our kids phones, video games, all of these, we know through metrics, they destroy our capacity for intimacy, or let's say whittle away and eventually destroy our capacity for empathy. When we're giving our 2-year-olds iPhones to babysit them as surrogate babysitters, and that is not only messing up their optic nerves, but they no longer have the capacity to understand emotions on people's faces because of the two-dimensional world that their brains are being filtered through. Let alone, so often I'm in conversation with activists who their entire lives are based on racial justice and environmental justice, yet because the idea of safety, and this is safety as in a state framework, is so ingrained in our consciousnesses that they think that their kid eventually, their 12-year-old does need a cell phone. I find that extremely upsetting when we just see it as the go-to, because it seems impossible to change. And again, anarchy, the only way we're going to do it is by doing it. The only way we're going to make these changes is by stripping ourselves of these norms, by stripping us of what we think we know. And I mean a violent stripping, because it is violent, and re-inhabiting the capacity for children's neurological vastness. And it's got to be that intergenerational simultaneity that confronts petroleum parenting, that is an antidote to petroleum parenting.
Thank you. I want to ask many more questions on this, but I think it's good to open the floor up for questions as well for the last 10 minutes. Just wanted to say, you write somewhere also that you say parenting could be an art and science of collaboration, and I like that as an idea. I think you also talked about that already. But yeah, so I would like to open the floor up for questions, and comments could also be about your work, because there's been a projection an exhibition here called Epigenetic Insurgencies, Eco-Justice, Anarchy as Collective Imperative. So if people want to say something about that, they can also do that, or ask other questions about the many things you've touched upon. That also goes for the online people. Also keep an eye on the chat.
If people are not raising their hand, I have a question.
Okay.
Or unless, does anyone have a question?
The question in the chat is from half an hour ago, I think. No? Or was there new? Yeah. No, so go ahead, Kara. Yeah.
Okay. Two questions. One is if people have thoughts about another word for interpenetration or this kind of weaving that we're describing, both the interweaving of oppressions that invite the simultaneous interweaving, interpenetration, enfoldment of emancipation. So I'm curious if people have a thought about framing that. And then also the idea of irritation. I loved, Alexis, that you used the word irritation several times. And yesterday I was giving a talk at Brown University, and I was asking for people to consider on the surface unexpected juxtapositions, and if they found it irritating. So I'd love to explore the idea of irritation when we're thinking about, for example, the state and a parasite. Like if the state is our host and we as citizens are parasites, and if we irritate the state, what that could actually create. I guess an obvious metaphor, is the dirt in the oyster and creating a pearl. But the idea of irritation as resistance, as an anarchist collective resistance. So those two questions I would have for people in the audience.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if people want to say something about that. Yeah, do you want to come here to say something, or all right, there's someone coming up.
Hi. Well, sorry. I don't have another word for what you were saying, but what I have been seeing during the past 5 years is that the word intersectionality is a lot more present than before. You know, this word, it comes also from North America. So that it reminded me a bit of that, the issue you raised. So there's a lot of talk around that now here in the Low Countries.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I'm resistant to intersectional, also because the boundaries in the idea of the intersection, it feels very, very linear and less like a ganglion. I'm curious in a neuroepigenic framework of the ganglion, which is clearly intersectional and cross vector, right? I mean, it is both of that. But what does it mean to be autonomous and simultaneously deeply rooted in one another's transformation, in our mutual aid, in our co-evolution that could potentially move from the Anthropocene into the Ecozoic era, where we are supporting one another through every aspect, our sexual, our economic, our ethnic. So intersectional, yes, except intersectional, like indigenous, like sustainability, like even the word surreal, all of those words, and trauma, these words have been so overused that, and they've been overused in an uncommitted way, I'll say, in a way that still keeps us safe in our individualist, in our privatized bubbles. So I'm looking to puncture that, the trickster, the both and. with all of you.
Well, I don't think there's a word for it in Dutch or anything, but like it also reminds me a bit of the word conviviality. It's not a word.
Conviviality, yes.
It's not a word much used either, convivialiteit in Dutch, but yeah, it reminds me of that also.
Thank you for saying that. What was your name?
Rafa.
Rafa.
Rafa. Thank you, Rafa. I want to show you two of my books. Both are rooted in the convivial, conviviality. Viscous Expectations, Justice, Vulnerability, the Obscene. And this is on the vulnerability of the body as a strategy for social justice. And then Zazu Dreams, Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era. And that's about conviviality using convivencia in Spain, the time pre-Inquisition, where the Jews and the Muslims. Oh, do you mind taking your mic off, Emma, because of the reverb? Thank you. Convivencia, the time again pre-Inquisition, where Jews, Muslims, Moors, and Christians lived in relative harmonious coexistence in terms of literature, the arts, sciences, where there was a co-flourishing, that conviviality. So Zazu Dreams, my cross-cultural climate justice book is looking at those historical examples of conviviality. So I love that you mentioned that. And of course, Ivan Illich's conviviality. I think convivial is one of the markers that we can work toward in a nonlinear sense. And Alexis wrote in interdependence. So absolutely interdependency. Yeah.
Ooh, thank you. I'm just gonna see if there's a final comment or question before we wrap up. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about. It was also nice to see your pictures here. So thank you for that. Maybe a final question I would like to ask is somewhere you distinguish between 5 layers of responsibility, which is of course very much in line with this conference. So could you maybe identify those 5 layers, and then yeah, people could take those with them to think about them if they want to.
Okay, yeah. And then I do want to ask about the photographs. Since the photographs were shown yesterday and today, is that correct?
So today, yeah. So today they have been shown during the lunch
They were
break
shown.
and the afternoon breaks in this room. Yeah.
And then I'm curious, within the framework of the conference, did people have a response to them?
Not really comments yet. So yeah, if people want to have responses later, they can. I'll make sure they'll get to you.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, in an anarchic frame, I'm always curious. So the 5 layers, looking simultaneously. I have been in too many environments, as perhaps many of you have been, with other activists, where, for example, we're dealing with environmental racism. For example, it's a symposium on environmental racism, and we're talking about ocean acidification and rising levels, ocean levels, and the panels and the panelists and the moderators have plastic cups that they're drinking out of, or plastic bottles that they're drinking out of. And I raise my hand in the audience and I ask, and this has happened probably dozens of times in the last 15, 20 years, something along this storyline. How is it that we are explicitly describing the extraordinarily vivid loss of human life, wildlife loss, ecosystem devastation in a climate justice context, a climate resiliency context, and we are sitting here facing the panelists who are drinking from plastic containers, as an example. And the response I get again and again is, we need to deal with infrastructural change. We need to deal with policy change. We need to deal with corporate accountability. And again, just like in the Occupy movement, I was in Oakland at the time, so I was right. My son was 3 months old. He had just been born. As an infant, we protested in the streets during the Occupy movement. We are the 99%, right? And the 99%, we are still capitalism. Consumers are capitalism. It's not just corporate. It's not just structural policy. It's the simultaneity of it. So when people on the panelists are telling me, and they're telling the audience, and they're telling their constituents, they're telling thousands, if not more, other activists, that individual behavior doesn't matter. Not only is it heartbreaking, it's incredibly foolish to divorce the individual from the collective, the individual from the community, from the corporate, from the policy, the infrastructure. So when I speak about those 5 simultaneous realities, I do feel that each of us have a responsibility to work with those entanglements, to work with those tendrils that often feel like they're suffocating because they are so bound. But then that's where the collective courage can come in, can step up. Because if all oppressions are interconnected, then all emancipations are also interconnected. And it's not about those of us who have a quote unquote privilege, who have the time, who have the supposed educational background to make these connections, because obviously people who are in the trenches make the connections every day because of the extraordinary suffering. But how do we create infrastructures with our individual behavior that ripple explicitly into our community? Again, fiber shed, food shed, watershed commitments, jumping into those impossibilities, those unknowns together, rippling into policy change that then reinforces. So coming back, this is absolutely nonlinear, into infrastructural change, where the infrastructure reflects the individual, reflects the community, reflects the corporate, where we're not just pointing our fingers at big oil and big gas and big pharma and big ag and big banks, but where we are witnessing with pleasure, not with guilt, but with pleasure, because again of the collective. I think the collective is the bridge that transforms shame and guilt as obviously a very unproductive form of social justice motivation to make paradigm shifts, but as pleasure activism. As Audre Lorde spoke about, an erotic politics, which I describe in detail in Zazu Dreams in relation to social ecology, that it is those interconnections that can invite a sense of euphoria as we work together to make change. And it doesn't have to be ambiguous in terms of how the change will positively affect certain members of society, but ambiguity as a multiple of clarities, a multiplicity of clarities, so that people from very different realms are affected positively, are affected joyfully, even if their worlds seem to be in contradiction to one another. And I don't think we have much more time, but I just very briefly, I live in a community that is replete with contradictions. And we are seeing that through land, literally our common ground, even though we are on multiple opposite extremes of political spectrums, of ideological spectrums, the common ground again and again is land. And it's that that root. It's not about one world, right? It's the multiplicity, it's the pluriverse of pleasure, I think. I'll say it this way, pleasure-driven pluriverse that I think can keep us motivated and not just completely depleted from being activists and academics and parents, but a reminder of these interconnections, of these 5 realms, and of course many more, but that it's not individual versus the collective, or personal versus the political, individual or private versus the public, but it's the simultaneity that can elicit the joy and the beauty in order to really make real sustainable change.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this note of overcoming these dichotomies and doing joyful resistance are very nice to end with. So I just want to thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
And with that, we actually also conclude our 2-day conference. So yeah, at your place it's still early, but here it's the end of the afternoon, and we have made it until the end with 2 days packed with sessions. I just want to thank everyone who's here, who was here and won't hear me, but whatever, and everyone who joined online. Yeah, some people are dropping in for closing the conference, I think, for making this the conference that it was. And we're going to wait a bit because we're also going to say something about the zines, because I saw something. So for the people online, we've been making a collaborative zine, and it has been printed now, so people can take home the zine that summarizes the things we did in this conference. Yes, so I will start again, I guess, yeah. So.
Now that more people are here.
Yes.
I think it's an excellent moment to thank you. Emma has done a lot for this conference. She came up with the idea while finishing her PhD that she just handed in. So, this week. So this week.